The wind along Pine Street made the afternoon feel older than it was, the kind of tired winter light that flattened everything into one long exhale. Evan kept his hood up even though the cold wasn't sharp, his head tipped down at the pavement, like he could will the cracks into neat lines. 2 plastic grocery bags cut into his fingers, the thin handles sawing a crescent into his palms with each step. Spare milk thudded against bread. The glass jar of peanut butter tapped a steady rhythm. He could have timed his breathing too if he wanted. He didn't. He just wanted the walk to be over, the front door to open, the kitchen to smell like anything other than the quiet it had been holding since his father's chair went empty. He reached the corner store and saw her before he saw the door. A small figure in a heavy wool coat with the elbows rubbed thin and a knit cap that leaned to one side as if it, too, was tired. She stood with 2 paper bags hugged tight against her chest, chin tucked down, eyes moving over the sidewalk like she was reading something no one else could see. She didn't look up to ask. She didn't look like the kind who asked for anything. She just adjusted her grip and tried to shift both bags higher in that careful, slow way of someone who's learned to work around pain. "Want me to carry those for you?" The words surprised him on their way out, like a step he'd taken without looking. She raised her eyes, pale and steady, and searched his face for a beat that felt longer than it was. Then she nodded, not grateful so much as accepting a gentle truth in the world. "That's kind of you," she said, her voice clear but quiet. Like the inside of a good church? He took one bag, and it was heavier than he expected. Glass clinked dully inside jars wrapped in newspaper, apples whose skins pressed sweet through the torn seam. They fell into step without ceremony. She said it was just a few blocks and pointed with her chin in the direction he'd already been headed. The silence between them was not empty. It had the softness of fresh snow. He shortened his stride without thinking. Her breath came in small puffs only in the first half block. After that, it smoothed out into something measured. "What's your name?" she asked as they turned past the barber shop, where a bell rang every time the door opened, letting out the warm cologne of old wood and talc. "Evan, Evan," she repeated, tucking it away somewhere safe. "I'm Miriam." She didn't offer a last name, and he didn't need one. The bag in his hand smelled like cinnamon, and the inside of her coat smelled faintly like lavender soap and old paper. The kind used for old letters that remember what was written on them. They crossed. Pine. The lights in Mr. Alvarez's bodega blinked in the window like stubborn stars. A boy in a puffy jacket rode past on a too-small bike, his mouth a line of determination. "You from around here?" she asked, without looking at him. "Yeah," he said. "Over on Willow." "The duplex with the blue steps?" "I know it," she said, and he believed her. She had the voice of someone who knew houses by their steps and stoops, who kept track of chipped paint like birthdays. They reached her walkway, and the bag shifted again, the apples rolling against glass. He followed her up 3 shallow steps to a porch that needed paint, but held itself upright with the dignity of old bones. She set her bag down and leaned for a second on the rail, not out of breath so much as out of a need to pause, like a period at the end of a soft sentence. "Thank you," she said. "You've saved my wrists." She lifted them, the thinness of them startling, the blue veins like a map of rivers you only notice when someone points them out. "It's no problem," he said, and realized he meant it in a way that made his chest feel a fraction lighter. He didn't move to go, though. She didn't move to open the door. They stood like that in the gray light, sharing a stillness that wasn't awkward. "Do you go to school over on Oak?" she asked, not nosy, just curious in the way of people who have not tired of the world. "Not anymore." The words came out flatter than he meant, a little harder at the edges. He waited for the follow-up, the gears of concern that turn into suggestion, into prescription, into sorry. She only nodded once, accepting a fact and leaving it alone. "I see." The porch creaked under their shoes. A wind pushed and then decided not to. "My son used to walk me home with groceries," she said, and her eyes went past him to a place he couldn't see. Before, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Something in the air shifted and settled and invited without insisting. Lost. "My dad last year," he said, and he was surprised to find his voice soft, like he was trying not to wake someone. The words hung between them with the weight of filled bags. She turned back to him, and the look she gave him was not pity. It was recognition, and it landed in his chest like a hand finding a steady shoulder in the dark. "Come by sometime." "If you're passing," she said. "Not for anything, just tea." He nodded, and she smiled like something had clicked back into place. He did pass again, the very next day, and then every few days after that, as if the sidewalk itself wanted him too. The first time he stopped, it was to return the thought she'd left on the porch. He said tea. He said, feeling suddenly 16 and 11 at once. She laughed softly and let him in. The house smelled like something simmering. Onion and thyme, and the kind of slow that makes a home forgive you for being away. Inside, the rooms were narrow and held in the way old houses are, with furniture that knows its own weight. A small framed photo sat on a side table, Miriam younger by 30 years. A man beside her with kind eyes, and a boy between them with a missing front tooth. The boy's grin was a lighthouse in a storm that hadn't come yet. "That's Daniel," she said, seeing his gaze land. "My son." She touched the glass with the back of her finger the way you touch a forehead to check a fever. They drank tea that tasted like something green and honest. She talked about the neighborhood like it was a person she loved. How the maples used to reach fingers over pine like the hands of gossiping ants. How Mr. Alvarez kept a notebook behind the counter where he loaned $5 at a time to people who always came back. How the church on Elm turned its basement into a warm room. On nights the cold dared people to stay outside. Evan listened and realized he knew the outline of the place, but not its story. The way you know a song without knowing who wrote it or why the bridge makes you feel like you're floating. He told her about the lake, where his dad used to take him for no reason except to throw stones and count the skips until the water accepted them. He told her about the way his mother had stopped humming in the kitchen and how his little sister laughed too loudly now, like she was trying to find the edges of silence. He didn't tell her about the ache that sat behind his collarbone every morning. He didn't have to. It was in the way he rubbed his thumb over the seam of the mug, the way his shoulders rose and fell like they were carrying something not in the room. On a Saturday that remembered to be bright, she asked if he could bring down a box from the attic. The stairs were steep and narrow, the kind that force you to turn your shoulders sideways. The attic smelled like old cedar and dry summers. Dust made shapes in the light. The box was heavier than it looked, not because of what it contained, but because of what it meant. He set it on her kitchen table and opened it when she nodded. Inside were envelopes tied with cotton string, each one fat and careful. Names were written on them in careful script: Alvarez Green, Patel Sanders. Each had a date. Each had a small key taped to the inside flap. "What is all this?" he asked, not wanting to disturb anything with the wrong tone. "Receipts," she said, "and promises." She lifted one, untied it slowly, smoothed the paper like you might smooth a child's hair. Inside were letters, some on lined paper, some on the backs of flyers. Rent notices paid. Property taxes covered when winter took too long. A layaway canceled because no one should have to choose between boots and heat. And in among them, deeds and copies of deeds, photocopied maps with shaded rectangles where the homes stood like pieces of a story you could hold in your palm. "My husband, Nathan, started it," she said. "He saw the way one bad month could knock a family sideways and make them feel like they were wrong for falling. After he passed, Daniel took it up without telling anyone. He said, 'Dignity, like bread, belongs on the table without announcements.'" Her voice did not break on her son's name. It carried it like something precious. Evan leaned closer, the air around the table thick with paper and memory. He ran his finger over the words Hall Street Community Trust, typed at the top of a receipt in a font from before his lifetime. "You been doing this? All this time?" he asked. And he wasn't sure who the "you" was, only that it reached backward and forward through her kitchen. "Quietly," she said. "People hearing you did them a kindness can make them feel watched. We preferred to be the kind of help that lets you forget you needed it." She smiled sideways, a little apology and a little pride. "Aren't what they were. And something new is pressing." Ouch. She reached under the papers and brought up a crinkled envelope with a seal like a school crest. He recognized the developer's name immediately. It started appearing on Glossy. Postcards in the mail with pictures of neat townhomes and words like revitalize. "They've offered to buy Mr. Alvarez's building," she said. "And the lots behind. The church has been getting visits. A few of the landlords are listening. People think this block is an investment. They forget it's a neighborhood."
Evan
Felt a heat rise that had nothing to do with the kettle. He'd watched the postcards pile on the kitchen table at home, his mom putting them in a stack like junk mail, and then smoothing them down like something you shouldn't throw away until, "You're sure it's safe?" "What can we do?" he asked, the we surprising him with how right it felt. Miriam's eyes softened, as if he had passed a test she hadn't told him he was taking. "We can bring it into the light without making a show," she said. "Can remind people who they are before someone else sells them a version." She slid him a worn ledger, the cover edge soft from being opened and closed. Inside, neat columns, charted loans forgiven, taxes paid, repairs made, names upon names. At the bottom of one page, in a younger hand, was a note. "Transfer of deed held in trust pending beneficiary consent." Next to it, a small arrow pointing to a file number. "Daniel kept this," she said. "He thought one day we might need to show our work. He thought one day the neighborhood might need to see itself." They started small. Evan carried more boxes down, and together they made stacks that meant cents. Miriam wrote names on index cards and slid them under piles like place cards at a table where everyone had a seat. He ran paper through a scanner. His mom used 4 coupons and watched as the screen filled with a history that wasn't in any textbook he'd seen. In the afternoons, he went home to drive his sister to practice and make sure the pot on the stove didn't boil over. And after dinner, he found his feet bringing him back to the porch with the paint that needed doing. Not every visit was paperwork. Sometimes they ate soup that tasted like patience. Sometimes he carried groceries and listened to her narrate the walk. The cracked step on Green's porch. The way Mr. Patel waved with 2 fingers when his hands were full of flour. The cat that belonged to no one and everyone. He began to notice something he hadn't before. How people looked at Miriam without asking. The tiny nods that passed like currency. The way her name traveled through the air like a soft bell. Mrs. Hall, some called her. Miss Miriam, others said, adding a sweetness to the miss that made it not about age but affection. One evening, he arrived to find his mother sitting at Miriam's table, her work jacket folded over her lap like she was visiting a doctor. She looked up at him with a mixture of surprise and relief. Miriam poured tea and said, "Your son's been helping me with errands and old papers. I hope that's all right." His mother's eyes shone, the kind of shine you take to another. It's more than all right," she said. "It's been carrying too much weight without asking for help." She reached a hand across the table and Miriam took it, to women building a small bridge of skin and warmth. When the letters were digitized and sorted, when the ledger had been turned into a map of who was helped and how and when the stack of glossy postcards from the developer had been fanned out on the table like a weak hand in a strong game. Miriam said it was time. Not for a fight, she said. For a remembering. She asked Evan to write a note and bring it to the church on Elm. The note was simple: community gathering, stories and tea. No subject lines, no calls to action. Just an invitation to sit in a room together and speak out loud what people had been saying in their kitchens. The night of the meeting, the church basement smelled like coffee and cinnamon. Folding chairs lined up in crooked rows, and the radiator hissed like an old uncle. People came in small groups or alone. Mr. Alvarez wiped his hands on his apron and stood by the door, greeting everyone with the same buenas noches that made you feel like you were someone he'd been waiting for. Ms. Green from down the block brought a plate of cookies, ranged in a circle like a clock that decided to be dessert. The Pastor Ruth, with a laugh that caught light, kept filling cups until the table was a forest of steam. Miriam walked in with her shoulders square and her steps small. Conversation softened into a hum. She took a seat on the first chair of the first row and waited until the room settled into itself. Evan sat 2 seats behind, aware of his breath for the first time all day. "I don't keep speeches in my pocket," Miriam said, when the pastor handed her the floor. "But I know a story or two." She told him about Nathan and the way he kept a spare key under a rock for any neighbor who might need to borrow his ladder. She told him about Daniel, how he hated attention and loved lemon cake, how he'd made her promise not to make a fuss if he brought groceries to the door of a family who was between jobs. She told them about the envelope with the developer's seal and how the words in it made her knees feel like they didn't belong to her. She lifted the ledger and placed it on the table in front of her. "This is not proof of goodness," she said, and her eyes went around the room as if counting. "It's proof of us, that we exist together."
"That nobody here is alone on their worst day."
She did not raise her voice. She did not ask anyone to clap. She opened the ledger and pointed to names that sat in the margins of one another's lives. "When you paid your taxes late in '03, Miguel," she said, nodding toward Mr. Alvarez. Nathan wrote the check and asked the clerk not to say. "When the roof leaked at Green's, this ledger says 6 of you went up with tar and prayer. The day before the storm, the trust is paper and signatures. The neighborhood is you." A murmur rose. Not shock exactly, but something like the sound you make when a picture comes into focus. People turned to each other and to themselves, stacking moments they'd almost forgotten. Evan looked around and saw faces shift from worry to memory. This, he thought, is what being seen looks like when it doesn't need a stage. Then Miriam lifted a small stack of manila folders and laid them beside the ledger. "These," she said, "are deeds." She paused, letting the word rest. "Held in trust for as long as we needed to make sure the houses on Hall and Pine and Willow stayed. With the people who made them homes. There are transfer documents here that need signatures. There are letters to landlords reminding them of commitments they made when Nathan loaned money for repairs. There are also 2 envelopes addressed to the developer that I will deliver in." The morning, the room shifted, the air suddenly taller. "One denies the sale of Mr. Alvarez's building. It is not mine to sell, though some thought it was. It belongs, as of next week, to a cooperative of neighbors whose names are in that folder. The other is a copy of the deed to the lots behind, with a clause I don't think they found. It codifies the land as a community easement for gardens and gatherings. Granted in 1987, signed by a city clerk who married my cousin and owed me for casseroles. It was recorded, just never noticed. You're not for sale." The room did not erupt. It softened first, like a blanket being pulled up. Then the sound came, tears that were laughter's older sister, hands clapping in rhythms that found each other. Scrape of a chair as someone stood not to be seen. But because their body needed height, Mr. Alvarez leaned over the back of a chair and cried into his sleeve. Pastor Ruth held out her arms as if to gather the whole room. "Miss Miriam," someone said, not sure whether to sit or stand or kneel. She waved a hand. "I didn't do this alone," she said. "And I won't finish it alone either." She turned then, her eyes landing on Evan like a key in a lock. "This is Evan," she said simply, and it felt like the first time anyone had said his name where a microphone could carry a Tevin, though there was no microphone, only air and the permission to speak. "He carried my groceries when my wrists were more stubborn than my pride. He has been carrying boxes ever since. He has been carrying things I didn't realize I still held. The trust will need hands and eyes and hearts younger than mine." I'm asking. His head's turned. Evan felt heat climb his neck, but didn't look down. Miriam's trust wasn't a gold crown or a burden. This was a room being opened and lit. He nodded before he could wonder whether he was allowed to. His mother touched the back of his shoulder, and something inside him set down the thing it had been carrying for a year. The neighborhood did not change that night. It remembered itself, which is a kind of change the news doesn't know how to photograph. Over the next weeks, the legal work moved like a river that knows stones by their names. People signed papers slowly, reading each line aloud, asking questions. That made the answers better. The developer sent a polite letter that felt like a shrug. The church basement filled with seeds and catalogs and charts where children drew, where the sun hit in summer. Ms. Green bought a set of wind chimes that made the garden sound like silver rain. The man Evan had only seen grunt in greeting now laughed in the bodega, the sound like breaking glass in reverse shards becoming whole. On Saturdays, Miriam taught Evan to make apple pie. Not the quick way. The way with cold butter you cut with 2 knives until the bowl looks like first snow. "Don't rush the dough," she said, "or it will remember and hold it against you. He learned to listen for the right sound a knife makes against a wooden board. He learned to watch for the moment sugar goes from grain to gloss. He learned to sit while something baked and let his mind be warm instead of busy. They did not talk about Daniel every time. But when they did, it was without the careful chosen words people use when they are trying more to be right than real. He hated wearing ties, she said once, smiling to herself as she crimped the edge of a crust. Nathan used to loosen his before we reached the church steps, so he wouldn't feel like he was being strangled. She didn't tell the story to make a point. She told it to let the air inside the room be fuller. One afternoon, Evan brought his sister, Mia, who sat on the back steps and read out loud from a book between bites of a cookie that was supposed to be for later. Miriam's kete hadn't known she had one because it came and went as it pleased. Threaded itself through Mia's legs and chose her, as cats do. Later, when the pie was on the table and the first cut released a steam that smelled like patience and late summer, Miriam took a photo of the three of them with a phone that surprised him with its age. "For the wall," she said. And he looked at the wall where photos hung without a frame between them, just tape that had learned to be careful. News of the meeting traveled, but not the way gossip does. It moved like someone whispering a secret into a sleeping room and waking it gently. People from nearby blocks came to the bodega to ask questions and buy bread. The landlord, who lived out of town, called and found himself speaking to a group rather than a single tenant. His voice hovered. On the phone line, like a dragonfly, a college student who'd grown up on Pine drove in from a city 2 hours away with a car full of donated tools and the grin of someone who'd discovered how to carry home in a trunk. The developer mailed a second letter with bolded words. Neighborhood mailed back copies of maps and clauses and the kind of politeness that ends a conversation without the need to say so. The church's garden took shape under the kind vacuum of shared effort. There is no silence on the earth as generous as neighbors planting. Children learned what basil smells like when you bruise it between two fingers. A bench appeared beneath. The oldest maple? No one claimed it, so it belonged to everyone. One evening that remembered to be golden. Evan and Miriam sat on that bench as the shadows remembered each other and braided themselves into the grass. The garden smelled like tomato vines and wet soil. Little girl ran past with a watering can larger than her own torso, tongue out in concentration. Miriam leaned back and let the sun find the space between her collar and her hair. "I kept it quiet so long," she said, not regretful so much as amazed at the shape of time. "I thought if people knew, it would make something heavy where there had been help. But secrets, even kind ones, ask to be carried, and there comes a day when you're allowed to set them down." She turned her head to him and smiled like, "A candle knowing its flame is enough. Thank you for giving me a place to put it." Evan watched a bee consider a marigold and thought of all the days between the lake and this bench. All the mornings his chest had felt like someone had quietly stood on it while he slept. The weight was still there, a stone that remembered rain, but it was not his alone. "I didn't do anything," he said, and heard how untrue it sounded as he said it. "You did the thing," Miriam said, amusement tucked behind her words. "You carried what you could without making me feel small. That is not nothing." He walked her home in the not quite dark and waited on the porch while she searched for the right key among the four she kept on a brass ring. She handed him an envelope without explaining and nodded toward the steps. Inside, he found a letter, with his name written in the same careful script as the old receipts. It was not a deed or a check or anything that would make a bank sit up. It was a letter from Daniel, written years ago to whom it may concern. A message folded back into the present. "If you are reading this, it means my mother trusted you with what we've been trying to do. Please remember we are not here to save anyone. We're here to hold a corner of the net steady. P.S. Don't let her carry too much up the attic stairs." "She won't ask." He laughed, the sound startling in his throat at first and then fitting. He looked up to find Miriam watching him from the doorway, her eyes bright with the trick light plays when it meets old glass. "He had your stubbornness," she said, and he shook his head because stubborn was not what the letter felt like. It felt like a hand off stage, steadying the curtain. Summer leaned in slow. The garden broke into red and green. The cooperative signed papers in the back of the bodega with ink that left a shine before it left a mark. The postcard pile on his mother's table stopped growing. People still argued about where the hose should be stored, about whether the swing set needed a second coat, about whether the tomatoes were being stolen by squirrels or a boy named Dante. But the arguments belonged to people who expected to keep seeing each other. When August tipped towards September, Evan stood outside the high school on Oak with a form in his hand and a ridiculous nervousness he felt in his knees. The secretary looked over her glasses and asked whether he meant to re-enroll. He did. He didn't tell her why. He didn't need to. He thought about Daniel's letter and the word net and how maybe school could be a thread, not a trap. On the way home, he detoured down Pine just to pass the bench, which now had a small plaque, someone's idea. Not his that read, simply for the carrying. He sat for a minute, felt the wood give under his weight, and watched as Miriam instructed. A boy and how not to drown a plant with love. The day she told him the last part of the secret was not a dramatic day. It was Tuesday, and the light was wrong for photographs. She brought him a small tin from the top of the cupboard and set it down the way you set down the last piece of a puzzle. Inside were 3 keys and a note. Community pantry back room. The trust has always been more than money, she said. It is also organization. We're good at caring, but we needed shelves. The back room of the bodega became a place where dignified help lived in plain sight, no forms, no performance. Take 2, leave 1 if you can. Write a favorite recipe on the wall. The neighborhood shook again, not with scandal or spectacle, but with the quiet clink of jars being placed where hands could find them. On a night when the air turned again toward cold. Miriam pressed another envelope into Evan's hand, this one lighter. Open it later, she said. He did, in his room where the overhead light was too bright and the lamp lit the color of a book spine. It was a photograph Miriam, younger by a breath. Daniel, older than the missing tooth picture, Nathan behind them, and a space just to the side, where someone clearly was meant to stand. Written on the back in Daniel's hand, the person carrying the other end. He put the photo on his dresser, leaned it against a jar of coins. He lay back and stared at the ceiling where the plaster made continents, and he felt the ache in his chest not loosen but shift, making room beside it for something else. Not joy, not yet. Something like the knowledge that when he woke up there would be a kitchen where humming could happen again if someone started it. The first frost came, as the garden browned at the edges, beautiful in that last color it wears. Before sleep, the bodega windows fogged for good reasons. On a Sunday morning that smelled like wool and coffee, Evan walked Miriam to the bench. She sat and handed him a small paper bag that weighed almost nothing. Inside was a folded scarf, blue like the door he'd never gotten around to painting, and a note he didn't read until he was home because he'd learned to let moments be the size they were. The note said, "You do not have to carry it alone. To carry it well." He did not cry. He did not make a speech. He placed the scarf around his neck and went to the kitchen where his mother was stirring a pot. He began to hum without choosing the tune, something like the one Miriam used to hum Crossing Pine when the light turned against them. His mother looked up, startled for a second, then smiled into the steam. The house listened, grateful for sound. If anyone asked what shook the neighborhood, it would point to the meeting or the letters or the way the developer stopped calling, but the truth lived smaller. The way a door got propped open with a brick and never closed again. The way a boy's name was said into a room and echoed back. The way a woman set down a quiet secret and found that the ground could hold it. On Pine Street, where winter liked to linger and stones liked to keep their secrets, people began to carry one another's weight without making a spectacle. That was the revelation. That was the shaking. And in the middle of it, between a porch with chipped paint and a bench with a simple plaque stood, a teenager with a letter in his pocket and a scarf around his neck would learn that sometimes the heaviest thing you can pick up is the corner of something shared.